At the end of August, the Zimbabwean government banned the maize imports. Yes, you heard that right. They banned the imports of maize to Zimbabwe. And I'm sure you're probably asking, what is this about? Because we have all been talking about Zimbabwe needing to import more maize. And even in the past marketing year, they were the largest maize importer from South Africa. You remember we were in a drought period in 2024. And many countries, including ourselves here in South Africa, were hard hit by that drought. But Zimbabwe was one of the hardest hit countries. They lost roughly 60% of their maize crop. In Zambia, they lost half of their maize crop. Here in South Africa, our maize crop was down by roughly 21% from the previous season. We had, though, to still export maize to the season. And thanks to seasons before that, because we started off the year with a huge carryover stocks, which enables South Africa to have a bit of supplies. And one of the countries that needed a lot of maize in the African continent was Zimbabwe, to an extent that if you looked at South Africa's maize exports, last year to the world market, about half of them went to Zimbabwe. We exported just over 2 million tons of maize. And now you fast forward to this current season. It has been excellent across the Southern Africa region. And in fact, one can argue that we got too much rain than what we bargained for in South Africa. You've all heard us say here on AgriView that there were maize quality issues in South Africa. It was mainly because of that excessive moisture. But all things considered, the harvest is great across the Southern Africa. Here in South Africa, we are expecting a maize crop of just over 15 million tons. And you know that we need only about 12 million tons for ourselves. Zambia is also seeing an excellent crop of over 3 million tons. They need just around 2 million tons for themselves, which again means that Zambia has the surplus. Zimbabwe then is seeing such gains as well. But of course, we don't know how much maize is actually there. There's a lot of production that is happening under the small-scale farmers. And it could become a bit of a difficulty to get a sense of what's happening there. But we have our colleagues at the United States Department of Agriculture. No, not in Washington. Here in Pretoria, they do send people on the ground to survey, get a sense of what's going on there. And what they are telling us, I'm looking at their figures here, is that Zimbabwe likely have about 1.3 million tons of maize. Now, if you think about last year, where their crop was down to levels around 600,000 tons, this is quite a big jump, and it places them at the right position. And now that means they have some maize supplies for now, probably up until the end of the year. But my sense is that this current ban that the government has put in place is not going to last forever. Because if their maize crop is at around 1.3 million tons, then that will not be sufficient to meet their annual consumption. Because remember, Zimbabweans consume roughly about 2 million tons of maize. But of course, the 1.3 million tons is what commercially is available or is produced as per the USDA. That's the United States Department of Agriculture, Pretoria office says. If there are any deviation, and perhaps maybe we are undercounting what the small-scale farmers are producing, we may see then that number being slightly higher than where it is. But I think all things considered, they still probably are less than what they need on an annual basis. Then why is the Zimbabwean government banning all of these imports? Part of the reason is that this large crop that we have has led to a decline in maize prices. I mean, you look at South Africa, you look at the maize prices, they are plus 10% less compared to where they were last year. And the Zimbabwean government is probably looking after the farmers at this time around and saying, we don't want the floor price of maize to drop below a certain figure. And the only way then to do that, at least in the near term, is to temporarily restrict all of the imports and focus on the supplies that are there domestically. They are thinking about the farmer. And someone may ask and say, what about the consumer? And yes, what about the consumer? Because then the consumer could be benefiting from that available maize that is there in South Africa, there in Zambia, at a much more affordable prices. And I think that this disruption that happens in the market, whereby at a particular period you're protecting the consumer, at a particular period you're protecting the farmer, it does cause a bit of a disruption. And of course, it messes up the planning for those that are involved in business a little bit. And it's something that in the continent in general, we always have to try to intervene interfere and intervene in the markets as minimal as we can, and not always jump in the market and cause some of these disruptions. Because I think for long-term investment, for long-term policy consistency, they can be an issue. And I know people will be like, oh, you're arguing for these imports because you want the South Africans to send the maize exports to Zimbabwe. And yes, I do want the supply chains in the continent and in the region and the flow of production and the flow of produce to pretty much be more integrated. We talk about these regional value chains. These regional value chains are not going to be as flowing and as solid if we keep interfering in the markets and causing some of these disruptions that we are seeing. And Zimbabwe is always one of the largest markets for the South African maize exports, particularly white maize. And as I said, last year, it was the largest for all of the maize export. And South Africans came in to ensure that they assist on the shortage that was there. And they were not doing goodwill per se, because of course, this is commerce. Someone had to pay for the maize to get there. But with that said, those supplies helped in ensuring that in the region, we are sitting in a better condition. This time around, though, if you are farming in South Africa, I think the core message for you is that the Zimbabwean market, at least in the near term, it's not going to be as available. And anyone who looks at these things and look at the weekly exports of maize from South Africa to Zimbabwe, you will see that somewhere from July all the way to the end of August going into beginning of September, those exports are dried up a little bit. And that shows exactly what is going on at this time around. What then South Africans should be doing is looking more of saying, can we push some of the volumes to the Far East markets? We already started to see that our exports to Japan, to South Korea, Taiwan, and all of these regions are gaining momentum. And I think we have to continue with that flow of the exports. And yes, those markets are largely for yellow maize because they use it for feed. But I think that's the flow that we have to be doing as South Africans when we are thinking about the exports. But I believe that at the end of the year and going into the first quarter of 2026, we may see Zimbabwe reversing this decision, because the 1.3 million tons of maize, or even if it's slightly higher than that, if we are undercounting the produce from the smallholder farmers, it will still leave a bit of a shortfall from the 2 million tons that the country needs for its annual consumption. And I think at that time then, you will begin to see the regional demand picking up from South Africa. And I think even if you're looking at the commodity prices, the maize prices, they may start to tick up a little bit towards the end of the year and going into the next year, which will be resembling exactly the issue around the demand from the region. But all of the other countries then looking beyond Zimbabwe, thinking about Eswatini, Lesotho, Namibia, those are still fairly open. And I think for the flow of white maize, if you are sitting in South Africa and exporting to these countries, that will be fairly fine. But if you are a consumer sitting in Zimbabwe, you are missing out from a cheaper maize that is out there in the world market because of this temporary ban that is there. But I think you have to consider it also the fact that in Zimbabwe, agriculture is one of their biggest sectors in their economy. If you think about their agriculture as a share of GDP, it's on a double-digit figures. It's pretty much significant. And I think that their government, if I'm putting myself in their shoes, what they are doing is about how they can potentially support then their farmers to ensure that they continue to strengthen their economy. Either that works or not, but I think we have to be open looking at these ideas from the both sides. From a South Africa where you are exporting, but also if you were a policymaker sitting in Zimbabwe. South Africa is this big giant that is bringing all of this affordable maize. At the end of the day, what did you do at the start of the season? You provided fertilizer, seeds, to ensure that your farmers can pretty much produce. And I think it is from that perspective where they decide then that perhaps it may be important for us to intervene in the market and ensure that we protect these farmers of Zimbabwe. But again, for long-term planning and for the consistency of the business conditions and the investment, this does cause disruptions. The one part that I would desire when I think about these things is, again, going back to the basics of saying, how can we strengthen the African agricultural sector? One is, let's avoid interfering in the market the way that we are doing, either on prices or limiting imports or exports. Because there are some that on drought periods, they put an export ban, like we typically see in Zambia. Let's make sure that we strengthen land governance, the title deeds, the formalization, that begins to be an important aspect for stimulating investments and the agricultural production in the continent. The second aspect is about the infrastructure, where spending has to be done by the government on ensuring that the infrastructure to enable the farmers to move their produce and lessen the transaction costs is something that is also necessary. Those are amongst some of the key intervention. And I will say again, something that we had discussed in AgriView in the past, let's embrace technology. The better seed cultivars, they are among some of these productivity inducing interventions that are necessary. But that's it. In Zimbabwe, they've banned the maize imports for now. But my sense is that at the end of 2025, going in 2026, they may lift that. A lot depend on how much maize is on the ground, but we believe that they may actually have a bit of a shortfall. We appreciate you watching our segment. And of course, there are many people that make this segment to be a success. And one of those that will actually be coming on the show to support, we already have our friends from Santam, and we have our friends at Nedbank, who are among some of the people that may be supporting us in this show. And subscribe and share the content widely, and we'll be back with another segment. Thanks for watching.